Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. You've handed us a really fascinating stack of material this time, all centered around, well, one of the most recognizable books in English,
Yeah.
the King James Version of the Bible.
That's right, yeah. Often called the King James Bible or KJB, sometimes the authorized version, or AV. It's a text we all sort of recognize, even if it's just phrases that are part of the culture.
Absolutely. And based on these sources you shared, our mission today is to really, dig beyond just recognizing the name. We want to understand why this translation happened, how it was actually created by what, dozens of scholars, and what makes it distinct, particularly compared to its big competitor at the time, the Geneva Bible.
Yeah, and it wasn't just like a straightforward translation job, this deep dive into your sources. It really shows a story shaped by, well, everything: history, politics, theology, even the way they use language, the rhetoric.
Right.
Its influence is huge, no doubt, but how it got there and its relationship with those other Bibles. It's full of twists and interesting paradoxes, really.
Okay, absolutely. So let's unpack this. Let's set the stage historically.
Right. To really get the context, we have to jump back to the Reformation, 16th century. A huge idea then was sola scriptura, this belief that scripture alone is enough for faith.
Okay.
And crucially, that meant people needed it in their own language, the vernacular. That really lit a fire under the need for English Bibles.
And you see some incredible early efforts there. I mean, Wycliffe's Bible, way back in the late 1300s.
Translated the whole thing into English.
But from Latin, right. And it was all manuscripts, no printing press in England yet.
Exactly. Then, early 1500s, along comes William Tyndale.
A key figure.
Absolutely revolutionary. His New Testament, printed in 1526, that was the first English one translated directly from the original Greek.
And printed.
And printed, using that new technology. Made it way more accessible. He had this famous goal, didn't he? Making the Bible understandable even to a plowman.
Yeah, a powerful image.
Yeah.
Tragically, it cost him his life, martyred in 1536 for it.
It did. But his work, it didn't just vanish. The sources he gave us mention the Great Bible, 1539. That was the first officially authorized version put in English churches.
Okay, the first authorized one.
Then later, the Bishop's Bible in 1568. It was meant to replace the Great Bible, but, well, the sources suggest it never really caught on in a big way. It wasn't that popular.
Right, and this is where, looking at your materials, it gets really interesting. The Geneva Bible.
Ah, yes. Geneva. Published in 1560. Done by English reformers who were in exile in Geneva. Think John Calvin's influence.
And this one had some novel features.
Groundbreaking for the time. It was the first English Bible to use verse numbers. Seems basic now, but it was new then.
Okay.
And maybe even more importantly, it had extensive notes in the margins. Commentary.
And this one did catch on.
Oh, massively.
Oh.
The sources really emphasize how popular it became. It was the Bible for many English Protestants. The Pilgrims brought it with them to America.
Why so popular? The notes.
The clear language, the helpful notes. It was just very user-friendly. But that popularity, and especially what those notes were saying, that caused a lot of friction, which, ultimately paved the way for a new translation.
Okay, so the Geneva Bible is the people's choice, widely read. But King James I, he has problems with it. What exactly pushed him to commission a new translation?
Well, the sources point to the Hampton Court Conference in 1604. James was there, listening to grievances from the Puritan side of the Church of England.
Right.
And part of that was about issues they saw in existing Bible translations. In the middle of all this, the idea of a new unified translation comes up, and James, he jumps on it.
What was his angle? Just fixing translation mistakes?
Not entirely, no. According to your sources, improving the translation was part of it, sure. But a really big driver for James was wanting a Bible that would actively back up the structure, the ecclesiology of the Church of England.
Which was Episcopal, led by bishops.
Exactly. He wanted a Bible that reflected that hierarchy.
And his instructions to the translators showed this.
Oh, very clearly. He laid down specific rules like keep the old traditional church words church instead of congregation, for instance.
Because congregation might sound a bit too independent.
Precisely. Less hierarchical. And then the big one, no marginal notes.
Which seems aimed squarely at the Geneva Bible, right?
Absolutely. That was crucial. The sources are clear. James specifically banned those notes because he found the ones in the Geneva Bible politically dangerous, offensive.
How so? What kind of notes are we talking about?
Well, the sources give examples. There was a note on Exodus 1, praising the Hebrew midwives for disobeying Pharaoh, civil disobedience.
Not something a king once encouraged.
Not at all. And another on 2 Chronicles 15, criticizing King Asa for not executing his idolatrous relative. The note mistakenly says mother, but it was his grandmother. James saw these as undermining royal authority, suggesting rulers could be defied or criticized. He wasn't having that in the official Bible.
I also noticed in the material you shared that point about the word tyrant. Used like 400 times in Geneva, but only 3 times in the KJV. That seems significant.
It's a striking difference, yeah, and it's often brought up to show the KJV being more friendly to monarchy, but the sources also add a note of caution there.
Okay.
There's no direct proof James ordered them to avoid the word tyrant. The original Hebrew word for king doesn't just mean tyrant, so its rare use in the KJV might just be a more literal translation choice in those places, not necessarily a deliberate politically motivated scrubbing.
But it still creates a very different feel between the 2 versions.
Definitely underscores the different political vibe, you could say.
So James orders this new Bible, specific rules, support the church structure, ditch the controversial notes. How did they actually pull it off? Sounds like a massive project.
It was huge for the time. The sources say over 50 scholars were approved, 47 actually did the work, and they worked on it for 7 years.
7 years, wow. How did they even organize that many people?
They split them up. 6 companies, they called them. 2 at Oxford, 2 at Cambridge, 2 at Westminster.
Okay.
Each company got a specific section of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, or the Apocrypha. They translated their bits, then reviewed each other's work, cross-referenced. It was very systematic. Multiple layers of review.
What texts were they working from? Was it all original Hebrew and Greek?
Primarily, yes. For the Old Testament, they used the standard Hebrew text of the time, the Masoretic text. For the New Testament, mostly the Greek editions by Theodore Beza.
Which relates to the Textus Receptus.
Exactly, what later became known as the Textus Receptus. And they used Greek or Latin for the Apocrypha.
But they weren't starting completely fresh with the English itself. They built on what came before.
Oh, definitely. The Bishop's Bible was their official base text. That was the starting point.
Right.
And this was part of James's instructions. They were allowed to consult other earlier English versions. Tyndale, Coverdale, the Great Bible, and importantly, the Geneva Bible, too.
Even though James disliked the Geneva notes.
Yes. Which is fascinating, isn't it? The sources actually note that when the KJV translators changed something from the Bishop's Bible, their new reading most often came from the Geneva Bible.
So they respected its scholarship, just not its politics.
Seems that way. They were trying to make the best possible translation based on the scholarship available, even borrowing from Geneva, while sticking to the king's rules about notes and certain key words. The sources also mention times they'd tweak the Hebrew reading based on the Old Greek Septuagint or the Latin Vulgate, especially in Old Testament spots seen as pointing to Christ, like Psalm 22.12. They went with pierced, following the Greek and Latin, instead of the Hebrew, which reads more like lions.
And Tyndale's influence.
Yeah.
How much of his work actually made it into the KJV?
A staggering amount. The sources estimate something like 80% of the KJV New Testament is basically Tyndale's wording.
80%.
Yeah. And around 76% for the Old Testament parts he finished before he died. His phrasing, his rhythm, it's the foundation of the KJV sound. They also pulled in some style and vocabulary from the Catholic Reims New Testament, especially for the KJV New Testament, adding some more Latin-sounding words.
So it really was a synthesis, a culmination of all these earlier efforts.
Exactly. And then, once the company's finished, there was a final review by a general committee in London, and Archbishop Bancroft, who was overseeing it all, apparently made a few last-minute tweaks himself, like making sure the word bishopric was used in Acts 1.20.
Reinforcing that episcopal structure again.
Right up to the end.
Let's circle back to that KJV versus Geneva comparison, especially what the sources say about rhetoric and theology. It sounds like the differences went deeper than just the notes. They were baked into the language itself.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point from the materials you gathered. How they used language to communicate authority was different. The KJV, being commissioned by the king, aiming to support the church hierarchy, it used rhetorical techniques like expansion, parallelism, deliberate pauses in the prose.
To emphasize what?
To emphasize kingly authority. Both God's authority and, implicitly, the monarch's authority on earth.
Okay. And the Geneva Bible's rhetoric. How did that differ?
Geneva reflected the Calvinism of its translators, so it had a more maybe democratic feel in its structure. And its rhetoric was all about God's absolute sovereignty, unquestionable power over human destiny. That was the core Calvinist idea.
That's interesting. The sources suggest that Geneva didn't need the same kind of persuasive rhetoric.
Well, the argument presented is if you start from the belief that God's total authority is just a given and indisputable fact, like Calvinism does,
Right.
then the language doesn't have to work so hard to convince you of it. It's just stating reality. So in this view, Geneva wasn't trying to rhetorically build authority for God because God's authority was seen as absolute, non-negotiable.
Like that Psalm 29.10 example the sources used.
Exactly. Geneva translates it. The Lord sitteth upon the flood, and the Lord doeth remain king forever. No big rhetorical pause needed between sitting on the flood and being king forever. From their viewpoint, those were just inseparable aspects of God's obvious eternal power. It didn't need linguistic reinforcement.
But both Bibles still describe God in powerful terms, like a warrior or king.
Oh, absolutely. Those metaphors are there in both. Like in 2 Samuel 7, God establishing David's kingdom forever. The difference, the sources argue, is in the rhetorical emphasis. How they use language around those metaphors reflected their underlying focus, Geneva, on God's absolute dominion. KJV navigating both divine and earthly royal authority.
The sources also brought up that view of Geneva being user-friendly, while the KJV's language was almost coercive.
Yeah, that's one critical take presented. But the counterpoint made is also important. Geneva, by hammering home God's absolute sovereignty in that Calvinist way, was also making a political statement about the limits of earthly kings compared to God.
Right.
Even if it wasn't overt criticism in the main text like the notes were. So you could argue both versions used language to project a certain view of authority, just in different ways.
Let's talk about the language itself, that famous majesty of style the KJV is known for. Where did that come from? And how did it end up influencing English so much?
Well, it's kind of a paradox, as the sources point out, that distinctive style, that huge influence. It didn't come from trying to sound modern back in 1611. No, part of it came from a conscious choice to be a bit conservative linguistically, to use language that felt traditional, dignified, maybe even slightly archaic for its own time.
Which, of course, creates issues for readers today.
Big time. 400 years is a long time in language evolution. You've got all the archaisms. Thee, thou, hath, maketh, behold, lest. Those are obvious.
Right.
But maybe trickier are the false friends words we still use, but their meaning has totally shifted.
Like that example, making a difference.
Exactly. Jude 1.22, of some have compassion, making a difference. Back then, making a difference meant distinguishing, discriminating between types of people.
Not having an impact.
Right. Completely changes the meaning if you read it with modern eyes. You really need that historical context.
And what about the actual biblical texts they were translating from? Modern translations often read quite differently than the KJV in places.
Yeah, this is a key point. The KJV translators used the best manuscripts they had access to in the early 1600s. For the Old Testament, that was the Hebrew Masoretic text tradition. For the New Testament, as we said, the Greek Textus Receptus tradition.
But we found older, potentially better manuscripts since then.
Exactly. The whole field of textual criticism has developed over centuries. Scholars compare thousands of ancient manuscripts trying to figure out the earliest, most original wording. Big discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s gave us much older copies of Old Testament books.
Right.
And many modern scholars think these older manuscripts are often closer to the original than the later ones the KJV translators had.
Can you give an example of how that changes the translation?
Sure. A classic one is Goliath's height. 1 Samuel 17. The Masoretic text, which the KJV followed, says he was huge, 6 cubits in a span, like 9.5 feet tall.
Wow.
But older manuscripts, including Dead Sea Scrolls fragments and the Septuagint, say 4 cubits in a span, closer to 6.5 or 7 feet. Still tall, but not quite giant territory. That's a big difference based purely on which manuscript you follow.
And it's not just manuscript differences. Our understanding of the languages has improved, too.
Yes, that too. The sources mention how our grasp of ancient Hebrew and Greek grammar and vocabulary is better now. Like the description of mining in Job 28, it's much clearer in modern translations because we understand the technical terms better than they did in 1611.
And the translation philosophy itself, that word-for-word versus thought-for-thought idea.
Right. The KJV generally aim for what's called formal equivalence, basically, word for word, trying to stick very closely to the original sentence structure and wording.
Which has pros and cons.
Definitely. It can preserve subtle nuances from the original, but it can also lead to English that sounds pretty awkward or unnatural today, like lick up the dust of thy feet from Isaiah.
Okay.
Many modern translations lean more towards dynamic equivalence or thought for thought. They prioritize getting the meaning across clearly in natural English, even if they have to rephrase things more freely.
But that involves more interpretation by the translator.
It does, yeah. More interpretation means more potential for the translator's own understanding or bias to creep in. That Zechariah 13.6 example is relevant here too. Wounds in thine hands in the KJV versus wounds on your chest in some others. That reflects different manuscript readings and potentially different theological interpretations layered into the translation history.
And it's also true that the KJV we buy today isn't exactly the same as the 1611 version, is it?
That's a really important point people often miss. The first printing in 1611 wasn't standardized like we expect today. Spelling was all over the place, punctuation was inconsistent. Yeah. And the words the translators added for clarity, like helper verbs or prepositions needed in English, but not explicit in the Greek or Hebrew, they used a different font for those. That later became italics, but even that wasn't totally consistent at first.
So someone cleaned it up later.
Yes, over time. There were various edits, but the big standardization came with the 1769 Oxford edition, edited by Benjamin Blaney. He regularized the spelling, punctuation, capitalization, formatting.
Yeah.
Pretty much any KJV you buy today is based on that 1769 Blaney text, not the original 1611. There were even infamous errors in early printings, like the Wicked Bible from 1631 that accidentally left out the word not in the adultery commandment.
Oh, dude.
And Blaney made tiny grammatical updates too, like changing the archaic possessive his to its in Matthew 5.13.
And some things from the 1611 originals are usually missing now.
That's right. The 1611 edition had a lot of extra material at the front. A dedication to King James, a long preface from the translators called Translators to the Reader, which is fascinating, by the way. They defend translation itself and say even the meanest translation is still God's word.
Interesting.
It also had chapter summaries and marginal notes, not commentary like Geneva, but notes showing different manuscript readings or cross-references. Most modern KJVs leave all that out.
So after all that work, how did people react initially? Did it instantly become the Bible?
Well, it got the official stamp of approval right away, authorized for use in Church of England services. That was huge.
But it didn't just sweep the Geneva Bible aside overnight.
No, not at all. Geneva was still incredibly popular, especially in Scotland and with the Puritan groups in England, who were maybe a bit suspicious of this government-backed Bible.
So how did the KJV eventually win out and become so dominant?
Several things happened over time, according to the sources. It was consistently printed and became more widely available. Being read aloud in church every Sunday meant generations grew up hearing it.
Familiarity breeds acceptance.
Exactly. And then, politically, the Geneva Bible started to look less appealing after the monarchy was restored in 1660. It was associated with the overthrown Puritan regime. Plus, there were legal battles over who had the right to print Bibles in England, which ended up limiting commercial competition for the KJV.
I see.
So by the late 1600s, early 1700s, it had pretty much become the standard English Bible across the board for Protestants. And its reputation changed too. Especially after that 1769 standardization, people started praising its literary beauty, seeing it as this masterpiece of the English language.
And its lasting impact. Just incredible.
Undeniable. The sources call it one of the most important books in English culture, period. A driving force in shaping the English-speaking world. Its language, its phrases.
It lives on the ear like music.
That's the quote, yeah. It's woven into our literature, our ethics, even our legal system.
And it's still the primary Bible for many groups today.
Still is. Anglicans, Episcopalians, conservative Anabaptists, some Methodists, some Baptists. It's used liturgically in the Orthodox Church in America. It's the standard for the LES Church. Yeah. Its influence continues.
Plus, it was the foundation for so many later translations.
Absolutely. The Revised Version, the American Standard Version, the RSV, the NRSV, they all started with the KJV as their base text.
Wow. Okay, that really was a deep dive. We've gone from the Reformation's push for Scripture in English through King James's specific political and religious reasons for a new translation. We looked at the huge collaborative effort to create it, how it compared and contrasted with the Geneva Bible, the details of its language, its textual basis, how the text itself changed over time,
right,
and finally how it achieved such enormous cultural status and lasting influence.
It's an amazing story, really, how a translation born from very specific historical moments and political goals managed to become so much more a text revered across denominations and profoundly shaping language and culture.
It really is. And it definitely makes you think about the whole process of translation.
Knowing the KJV's story, how word choices, manuscript differences, theological viewpoints, the political climate, even later editors, all played a part in the text we have today and how it was received. How does this deep dive change the way you might think about reading any translation, KJV or otherwise, old or new? Something to ponder.